All right, so you're diving into Kubernetes, and judging by this stack of resources you sent over, it looks like you're really trying to wrangle this whole container orchestration thing.
Yeah.
And honestly, who could blame you? Kubernetes definitely has a bit of a reputation, right?
Yeah, it can be a bit of a beast.
Can be a beast. That's why we're here for this deep dive, though. We're going on a myth-busting mission. We're going to uncover the beating heart of Kubernetes.
Wow.
And guess what? It's powered by our old friend Linux.
Yeah. What often trips people up is, they come at Kubernetes as if it's this entirely new universe of complexity. But the sources you sent really hit the nail on the head when they say that it's all rooted in the familiar world of Linux.
So it's like I've been unknowingly speaking Kubernetes this whole time just by knowing Linux.
Precisely.
Whoa. That's kind of mind-blowing.
Yeah, and once you grasp that, all the pieces really start falling into place. It reminds me of that phrase, Kubernetes is just Linux.
Okay. More than just a catchy slogan, though, right?
Absolutely. Your sources emphasize that Kubernetes isn't reinventing the wheel. It's building upon the really robust foundation that Linux already provides. Take containers, for example. A lot of folks, they stumble over this misconception that containers are just mini virtual machines.
Oh, yeah. I totally pictured them as like tiny computers running their own mini operating systems when I first started learning about this stuff.
Yeah. That's a super common misunderstanding. But the way one of your sources breaks it down is, think of containers more as isolated Linux processes. Remember seers and namespaces?
Yeah.
Those Linux features,
Yeah.
those are the backbone of container isolation and resource management.
Okay, so instead of tiny VMs, containers are more like processes.
Yeah.
With their own separate space to play in. All thanks to Linux doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes.
Exactly.
Okay.
And that's just one example. Let's talk about how Kubernetes handles something like networking between your applications.
All right, so we're diving deeper into the Kubernetes matrix here.
Yeah.
Unpack this for me.
So when you're configuring those connections in Kubernetes, you're essentially tapping into the power of Linux networking tools. Things like IP tables and network namespaces. They're all there, just with a handy Kubernetes layer on top to wrangle them.
So it's like Kubernetes is giving those fundamental Linux tools a little bit of a makeover, making them more manageable, especially when you're dealing with a whole army of containers and applications.
You got it. It's all about orchestration. It's about managing all those moving parts across your cluster. But it's always anchored in this core Linux principles. And this is where that Kubernetes is just Linux idea really clicks. Understanding those fundamental concepts makes Kubernetes feel less like scaling Mount Everest and more like a natural progression in your Linux journey.
I like that analogy.
Right.
You wouldn't try to build a skyscraper on a shaky foundation.
Right.
But your source mentioned this trend of people jumping headfirst into the world of containers and Kubernetes. Without that solid Linux base, what kind of trouble are they walking into?
Imagine this. You're faced with a container that just refuses to start.
Oh, no.
Frustrating scenario, right?
Yeah.
But with a bit of Linux know-how, something like checking the logs, which relies on understanding the Linux file system, becomes a simple fix. Without that foundation, it turns into a scavenger hunt in a labyrinth.
Okay, I'm starting to see the light here.
It's
like trying to troubleshoot a car engine without knowing where to even look for the dipstick.
Exactly.
You need that basic understanding of how things work under the hood.
And your source points out another interesting stepping stone on the path to Kubernetes mastery: Docker.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because Docker is basically a more user-friendly way to work with Linux containers.
Precisely. It's like a gentle introduction to the world of containerization. You get comfortable with the basics, which then makes that leap to Kubernetes feel less intimidating.
So it's about building that solid Linux foundation, then adding the Docker layer, and then Kubernetes starts to feel like a natural next step, rather than this gigantic leap into the unknown.
That's a great way to put it. You're essentially building a mental model for how these technologies connect and interact.
So we're establishing that to really master the art of Kubernetes. Understanding Linux isn't optional. It's essential. But how deep down the rabbit hole do we really need to go? It's like we're trying to bake this elaborate Kubernetes cake and we keep hearing Linux, Linux, Linux. But what ingredients do we actually need?
Yeah.
Do I have to be a Linux master chef first?
That's a great question. And the good news is you don't need to memorize every Linux kernel function, but understanding some core concepts is like having those essential baking tools, Your source emphasizes processes, namespaces, networking, file systems, and service management in Linux.
Okay, so let's break those down a bit.
Yeah.
What's the so what for someone who wants to wrangle Kubernetes?
Well, take processes. In Linux, everything is a process, right?
Right.
And containers are essentially isolated processes. Knowing how Linux manages processes, things like starting, stopping, monitoring, directly translates to managing containers in Kubernetes.
Ah, so it's like that systemed analogy from your source.
Mhm.
Managing Kubernetes nodes is like managing services with systemed, but on a much bigger, more containerized scale.
You're catching on. And just like you wouldn't want conflicting services messing things up in Linux, you need to understand how Kubernetes uses those underlying Linux features to keep your containers isolated and playing nicely together.
And that's where namespaces come in.
Exactly. Linux namespaces let you create these isolated environments for things like the file system, networking, even user IDs. So each container thinks it has its own little world, preventing conflicts and boosting security.
Okay, that's pretty slick. But what about actually connecting these containers? We were talking about networking earlier.
Right, and this is another area where your existing Linux knowledge translates beautifully. Imagine setting up networking between containers as configuring virtual network cables between them.
Okay.
You're using those same Linux networking concepts, IP addresses, routing tables, just with Kubernetes interface.
So learning those core Linux networking tools is like unlocking a secret level in the Kubernetes game.
Precisely. And let's not forget file systems. Knowing how Linux organizes and manages files is crucial for things like understanding where container images are stored, where logs live, basically, how to navigate the Kubernetes file system.
You know, when you lay it all out like that, it makes so much sense. It's like Kubernetes is speaking fluent Linux under the hood. And to be truly fluent myself, I need to master those core concepts.
That's a great way to think about it. And the more comfortable you are with those Linux fundamentals, the less daunting Kubernetes will feel. You'll start to see the connections, understand the why behind the what, and even troubleshoot issues more effectively.
Speaking of troubleshooting, you mentioned earlier that even something as simple as a container failing to start can become a major headache without that Linux knowledge. Can you walk me through that scenario? What kind of Linux detective work would be involved?
Absolutely. Let's imagine you have a web server container that suddenly decides to take a permanent coffee break.
Not the web server. Everyone panicking.
Right. Now, a Kubernetes dashboard might tell you that the container isn't running, but why? That's where your Linux knowledge swoops in to save the day.
So what's my first move?
Well, in the Linux world, when a process goes haywire, you check the logs, right? Same idea with containers, but you need to know where those logs live within the container's file system. This is where understanding how Linux structures, directories, and files is essential.
Okay, so I've located the logs. Now what? They're probably speaking Greek to me right now.
This is where familiarity with common Linux log formats and commands comes in handy. You might use tools like grep to search for specific errors or timestamps.
And suddenly I'm a Kubernetes Linux detective. I can almost picture myself in a trench coat, examining log files with a magnifying glass. But seriously, I see your point.
Exactly. And that's just one scenario. The more comfortable you are with Linux, the more equipped you'll be to diagnose and solve those Kubernetes mysteries that pop up.
You've convinced me. Mastering the Linux fundamentals is clearly mission critical for anyone serious about Kubernetes. But let's talk about that stepping stone you mentioned earlier, Docker. How does that fit into this Linux Kubernetes journey? So we've established this solid Linux foundation is key, but we're also talking about Docker as a stepping stone. Is it like a crash course in container ease before diving into the Kubernetes ocean?
That's a great analogy. Yeah, Docker lets you dip your toes into the container world. Without getting, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of Kubernetes, you're learning the basics of building, running, and managing individual containers, which are essentially like self-contained packages of your application and all its dependencies.
So with Docker, I can get a feel for how these containers work, how to build them, how to interact with them, all without needing to wrangle a whole cluster of machines.
Precisely. It's like practicing your culinary skills by perfecting a single dish. Before catering a banquet, you're mastering those fundamental container concepts in a more controlled environment.
And those skills then directly translate to the Kubernetes world.
Absolutely. Think about it. When you move to Kubernetes, you're essentially taking those containerized applications you built with Docker and deploying them at a much larger scale. But the core principles of how those containers work, the images, the processes, the isolation, all remain the same.
So it's like learning the alphabet before you start writing novels. Docker is that container alphabet that then allows me to write those complex Kubernetes stories.
Exactly. And the beauty is, once you're comfortable with Docker, many of those commands and concepts will feel familiar when you step into that Kubernetes world.
Okay, you've convinced me Docker it is. But looking back at all this amazing information, it feels like we're uncovering a bigger lesson here. It's not just about Linux and Kubernetes, right? It's about approaching any new technology by understanding the layers beneath it.
That's a fantastic insight. And your source hints at this as well. Instead of just diving into the latest and greatest tools, taking the time to understand the foundational technologies upon which they're built can be incredibly empowering.
It's like that saying, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day. Teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. Learning those foundational layers is like learning to fish in the vast sea of technology.
I love that. And it's not just about avoiding those, lost at sea moments. It's about gaining a deeper understanding of how things work, which makes you a better engineer, a better problem solver, a better technologist overall.
And honestly, just makes the learning process so much more satisfying. It's like discovering those hidden connections, those aha moments when you realize how seemingly disparate concepts are actually intertwined.
Absolutely. It transforms learning from a chore into an adventure. And who knows what other hidden treasures you might uncover along the way.
So to wrap things up, it's clear that understanding Linux isn't just a checkbox on your Kubernetes to-do list. It's the key to unlocking its true potential and becoming a true Kubernetes maestro.
And remember that journey starts with a single step, or in this case, a single Linux command.
And on that note, here's something for you to ponder as you embark on your Kubernetes adventure. What other technologies could you understand more deeply by peeling back those layers and exploring the foundational principles upon which they are built? Just something to think about.